Here we go. It is the Friday edition of the Writ Race, joined, of course, by John Wright at Maru Public Opinion. Keith Leslie is here, and of course, he is our regular co-host on the On the Ledge podcast. So we just thought we would kick around the entrails of the two debates that we had this week, the French and the English consortium debates. Let me make a bold prediction after all of that. I'm going to boldly predict, John Wright, a minority government. It's going to be either conservative or liberal, and that's based on the outcomes of those two debates because they were so momentous.
Oh my God! I was made to watch that last night because I had to do some radio afterwards. Otherwise, I wouldn't have. But the best thing was I got new hearing aids this week. I mean, people probably don't know that, but I had to wear hearing aids because I had some damaged ears from some years ago. And they come with Bluetooth now. So I was able to sit with the TV on, but on my iPhone, I was watching Lila Fernandez do the tennis. And then I was also watching the Blue Jays later on. If it had not been for that, Dave, I would have slit my wrists in a moment. I got to tell you. These are one of the only times in which Canadians get a chance to hear these leaders, but the reality is that hardly any Canadians tune in. I mean, it's you, me, Keith, and a bunch of other pundits and journalists who watch this stuff. Mom and pop front porch have learned long ago that to sit through this nonsense for 2 hours, with a prelude by CBC, with a breathless 2 hours before that, going through all of this stuff, followed then by another hour afterwards analyzing it. This is how they find out who wins. They tune into our podcast, the best one so far in the country, and they hear what we have to say, and then they go, okay, then they move on. The problem with the debate format is that the gotcha moment from Brian Mulroney is tried to produce all the time. Last night, they didn't even have an opening statement or a closing statement. Those leaders were made to stand there for an hour, a half an hour before it actually begun. You know, staring at a blank piece of paper to make it look as if they were actually doing something important. So the format looked like a game show. The consortium always has so many different reporters come on that it becomes about them, their personalities are in jail. Although I did like Evan Solomon, I got to say, I'm not anti any of the reporters, but the format is such that it's so accusatory, and even the moderator from the outset. It began like a prosecution as opposed to a moderation, and it continued that way. In 45 seconds, we were just getting into it. So I will say this. The English language debate, the only time I've ever seen it done right was with Rudyard Griffiths a few years ago when it was done at Roy Thompson Hall with the leaders. I think Stephen Harper was, I can't remember exactly, it was that long ago. He handled it so well that we heard and we listened and we understood. I'm glad I watched the TVA debate in French that I don't understand, but at least I figured out what they were saying, because otherwise I wouldn't have heard anything. So to your point, and sorry for the soliloquy here, Justin Trudeau needs to get his base motivated. He needs to get his voters out. All the polls show that the voters are anemic from him, and they're not going to get it out of what we're saying this morning. We're not talking about him. We're talking about the format, and frankly, he didn't rise to the occasion last night because he got pummeled by everybody else on the podium, and he didn't get enough time anyways. He looked like he was perspiring, yada, yada. Who won last night? Aaron O'Toole again for not losing. I thought that the Quebec leader, Mr. Blanchet, was the best. He's like your uncle who's sitting in the room and has nothing to lose at Christmas and fires off the odd comment about what present he'd rather have. Anna May Paul was good. I wish she had a party, but it didn't matter. And I thought Jagmeet Singh probably got in the best shots, but I think the losers in all of this were the people who tuned in and the people of Canada who should have got something way better.
So Keith will put John down as shit show. Check the box.
Yeah. It's like that sort of like, so you're not going to take a sign on your lawn, I take it. No, I don't know.
I've got to basically agree with everything John said, pretty much. And the big losers were indeed the viewers or the voters who wanted to watch and simply couldn't, especially in the face of some amazing tennis going on with young Layla. I would have absolutely been watching that had I not been being paid to watch the debate, and so I did.
You were paid?
You asked about
Where
the French and English
debate.
I thought watching the French debate was tough because it's not, I couldn't keep up with them, but by gosh, that English debate was just absolutely painful. The game show format of it all, these rapid fire 45-second answers off the top, when they were just actually not bad topics that we would want to hear a lot more than 45 seconds about. We would also want to see them debate head-to-head in this, especially Mr. Trudeau and Mr. O'Toole. And what we had, well, okay, you two pair off on this, and you three pair off on this, or go off at each other, and don't interrupt each other, but I'm going to keep interrupting. And, oh, by the way, we've got 4 journalists are coming in. We've got a bunch of questions coming in from the public. I don't object to any of those ideas, but as a format all piled together, it looked like, the typical camel that, a committee designed when trying to get a horse. It just was an abomination. And for viewers to try and sit through it, I can't imagine very, very many Canadians actually sat through that. The themes were appropriate, the stuff we would want to talk about, but there was just no actual chances for real debate. It was a debate with no real debate, and that in itself was painful. There wasn't as much talking over each other, although when they did, it was the 4 men, and Ms. Paul would just sort of back off, which was kind of interesting to watch. And she did get in a couple of thoughts. I thought, as John said, she was pretty good, especially it's her first time she's left Toronto in the campaign, and the first chance for most Canadians to even have any sort of, any sense of her at all. And I thought she was very strong on just getting herself out and the points she had to make. But, Mr. Trudeau was defensive. He was chippy. He was talking too fast. He didn't have, he was denying that there was the worst G7 record on climate change, and it seems the facts go the other way. He was very vulnerable on not getting the drinking water to all the First Nations, and it showed. Whereas Mr. O'Toole, he was confident, a bit too much in the smiley, a bit too much with the praying hands. But, it's a bit of a nervous tick, and it's his first chance to introduce himself to Canadians. And I think, again, as John said, by not losing, he comes away the winner, because Mr. Trudeau, the format just was the worst for him, it seemed, of all. He didn't adapt to it. And Mr. O'Toole just stayed on his message, stayed his thing, and, knocked down the things. He still was, defensive on the vaccine. He still doesn't have the right answer on why he can't get his candidates vaccinated. And Trudeau can't give the right answer on why he called an election. And I think those things are still playing out, despite most pundits saying that they wouldn't play out all the way to the end of the campaign. I think those two things are still top of mind for most Canadians, and still the issues that most people were looking for last night, and they didn't get to see real debate. I thought Singh, he absolutely got the best quote of the night by, talking on the climate change thing, saying O'Toole doesn't believe in it and Trudeau doesn't do anything about it. Not a bad line. Paul got a good one as well, looking at Trudeau and say, I don't believe he's a feminist, and then naming the women that have left the Trudeau cabinet or caucus. And of course, he turned around with him, Ms. Paul, I won't take caucus leadership lessons from you, because her party is just a mess. So there was some good shots going on, but these aren't the issues people want to hear about and vote on. And when they did, there was no real debate. I'll keep going back to that point. It was an abomination of a TV show, and it helped no one decide whom they should vote for. Might reinforce it. I think each party could say my guy or woman did well for what they were expected to achieve there, but voters did not come out benefiting.
Well, here's the problem with the whole thing, and I've had the opportunity over the years to sort of sit in on some of the conversations around that consortium organization and deciding, who's going to be doing what around the debate. But let's face it, the parties sign off on the format. The parties don't just say, bring it on. They've decided that they're going to be involved in that debate or discussion to some degree. And then they let the media consortium shape this entire thing. And I realized that in the last few years ago, they decided that they were going to set up this debate commission, and David Johnston was going to be the guy that was sort of going to oversee all of that. But there's no teeth there. There's nothing that says, John, for example, that the day the writ is dropped, you have 48 hours, we're having our first debate. And then the second week, we're going to have the second debate. And the third, we're going to have a 5-week, we're going to have 5 debates then. And that would be a far better way, even considering right now we're in the COVID pandemic where mobility and crowds are so limited anyway. Why aren't we doing it that way? This commission should be the one that drives this, not the media, certainly not the parties. And we're going to hold a debate, and if you don't show up, tough. And and that commission decides who's going to be there and what subject matter we're going to deal with. More or less what they do in the United States with presidential debate. And that way we would have gotten into affordability. We would have gotten into the question of, whether it was a childcare, daycare. We could have spent 2 hours just talking about each one of those things. That would have been a worthwhile discussion. Formats aside.
Yeah, but I can't agree with you more. But there's a number of issues that go with that. I mean, we've had political parties in my lifetime who've said, I'm not taking part in the debate. Like, screw
Yep.
you. I mean, I'm ahead or I'm behind and I don't want to be there. And they've managed to do that. So nowadays you can't really do that, because then you're kind of like, oh, well, he's snubbing Canadians and all that nonsense. You know, I even the format itself does disservice to the political people, because we've had to democratize all of this. You look in the United States and they've got a little bit of this, you know, let's have a comment from Joe Blow from Nebraska and somebody else from Wyoming or whatever. He's got a question. But they keep it at least to 2 or 3 people, and it's very solemn, it's very straightforward, and they only have two candidates who are on the stage. I counted last night, we had 16 speaking parts besides the actual candidates. Yeah. And Sachi Kroll began by saying, you know, and I'm sure the Angus Reid Institute polled people and said, what do you want to hear on the debate? So she says, and we had 20,000 people decide what we're going to talk about tonight. It's like, are you kidding me? 20,000 people? You should have talked about 4 things and let them freaking talk, you know. So I think it comes back to the format, but I don't know, when you get the media people involved and you've got a consortium, then they're going to put their players up, right? We had we had the Aboriginal TV on last night for the first time. Oh my God, you know, but it was the combative nature of it. I've never seen that. They all came with an attitude, all of them. And it was like, you know, what do you think about reconciliation? And right after a little bit, it was kind of like, yeah, you think so? That's not what I'm seeing from my viewers. It's like, where's this coming from? So to your point, I don't know how you solve it, except this. I know that if a group of women, given today's tenor, if a group of women had said, like the Women's League, we're going to have 2 debates, and we're only going to have 3 people ask questions, and it's not going to be on women's issues. It's going to be on a series of issues, and it will be serious, and the format will be an hour and a half, and we're going to do this with 3 of them, and the other 3, and then we're going to end with a statement. Like, if they came out and said it's not going to be women, no one would be able to refuse that. I mean, they can refuse Rudyard Griffiths, they can refuse a whole bunch of other people who should be part of something and say, no, I'll wait for the consortium. It has to be, like, if it was an Aboriginal group, or if it was women, or it was a mixture of the two that they couldn't ignore. But I'd want them to ask more than those specific topics. I think we'd be able to get away with it. But I don't know how we can, Dave. It's such a disservice to the rest of us.
Well, either we rebuild the whole idea of what the debates are supposed to be, or we scrap them. And I'm getting to a point, I mean, I put my hand up right now. I got through an hour and just barely an hour and a half of it last night. And I thought, I can't, I'm not learning anything here. I'm just not. Right?
Let's not scrap them, but let's go back. Debates used to be much better, in part because there was one moderator, not a bunch of questions from 4 or 5 different TV networks that must be represented, and then members of the public and whomever else. No. And I know he runs a competing podcast, but he's also a friend of ours. Steve Paikin is the absolute best neutral guy for this commission to come to, because he doesn't compete with all those other networks on a national basis. And he's so well respected for what he does in many areas, but especially he's done some great debate moderating. We've seen it happen. So why they don't go back to, that's the format thing. I too have a bit of history in this. In fact, 30 years ago, when I was a supervising editor at Canadian Press, I was sent to testify. I don't know how I got tabbed for this, because I was a junior guy in management, to testify at a royal commission into elections and debates. And I remember opposite me was Trina McQueen from CBC. I mean, talk about a heavyweight. I'm sitting there. And the CBC and their Ottawa bureau chief, Ellie Albom at the time, again, another huge industry heavyweight. And they were advocating then to have legislated debates, at least 2 or 3 during the course of each election. And the CBC would, of course, carry them, but they would be mandated for everyone to carry and whatnot. And I honestly, a lot of the private broadcasters were not on side with the idea of legislated debates. The CBC, of course, I say, was all on side with it. But that's 30 years ago. And it took that long, it took 25 of those years to get that commission. Mm-hmm. And they came up with what we saw last night.
Yeah.
So I think it's time to look back at what did work before. We always talk about that debate where Mulroney and Turner. How many moderators, how many people were asking questions that night? And again, there was debates between the leaders. They were actually allowed to engage with each other, not just try and, I need to respond to that shot he just took at me, as opposed to engaging on the issues, because they were all taking good shots at each other. So it was all about, I think John as well has made this point, and Dave, you have as well many times, people aren't watching the debates. They're looking for the next day, the clips that get played on TV and on radio, and then the discussions by people like us, the op-eds. And so they're all playing for those clips. They're all trying to get that out there, those zingers. And again, No one's debating the issue. So I think there's lots of options here, but I think we've had better debates than certainly we saw last night. And again, even out of this current election, the TVA debate seems to be the one everyone holds up to, is that we actually could learn something there. One moderator, one person asking questions.
And it's not run by the consortium. It was just TVA said, we're doing it, show up if you want. And and
we're big enough, you
by the
better
way,
show up.
You're not invited. Right. So so that worked out well. But let's kind of turn the page on this, because I know, John, before we came on, and we were talking to Warren Kinsella about this on the last episode, the idea that people are waking up on the Friday morning to find out what happened Thursday night. So here we are. We're spending half of this podcast talking about the structure of the show. And if I listened yesterday and watched a lot of what the reaction was around the French debates, and it was very similar once we got past the format conversation. There was nothing that came out and said strongly one way or the other that this party did well, this party did poorly, this party was sort of status quo. There was a real mix. I mean, if you would have listened to and watched enough media over the last couple of days, Trudeau could have been the winner by far or way at the back of the pack, depending on, what you were listening to or reading at the time. How does this inform now? We got 10 days. How does this inform at all any kind of discussion among the electorate in terms of where the vote's going to go?
Well, there's a few things, and I think we missed the biggest event that happened in politics in this country and in this election campaign yesterday, about 4.5 hours before the debate began, and that is where the Premier of Quebec stood up and said, you know what, Aaron O'Toole, I'm with that guy, and I'm not with Trudeau. Holy jeez. The most popular politician in the land for the last 2 years anoints the Conservative and says everybody out of the boat for that guy. So that's really big. So it automatically, turns the guns, in Quebec on Mr. Trudeau. And people have to understand that there's a lot of history between the Parti Québécois and the Bloc Québécois and the Conservatives. They're switchers. So that is a huge thing for Aaron O'Toole. Number two, it doesn't inform people today, but what it does do is two things. Number one is it takes clips out of what happened last night and it'll feed it into the social media and feed it into the campaign, because they'll figure nobody else watched it, so they'll just take the things that were best for their, it'll be Mr. Trudeau banging away at gun control and Aaron O'Toole, on one of his few times that he said something, out there doing things. But the third thing is I come back to the polling. Ipsos, my old colleagues had a poll out yesterday morning, and it's again very instructive with some of the things that Daryl Bricker and Sean Simpson do. They look at the momentum of the voters. Like how many people are actually of that party enthusiastic to go and vote for them? And what they've seen since the outset of the campaign is it dropped for Mr. Trudeau. It's not going up. And so what you assume from that, despite all the COVID caveats we've put on that, and barriers that people might have, is that Trudeau's got a real deficit problem. He has an anemic brand. He's got a bunch of people that are unenthusiastic to go out and vote for the Liberals. And so automatically, where it would have been before if the Conservatives were sitting at, like, say, 34 in the polls and the Liberals were at 33, the Liberals are actually ahead, because in certain parts of the country, that's where the concentration of the vote is. You look down in Atlantic Canada where Keith is, the Liberals would be sky high and the Conservatives would have like 5 seats, which is a way big change from the 1980s, but it is what it is. So it means that there's what we call in politics a ballot bonus for the Conservatives. 79% of those people who are voting Conservative want to go out and vote. You're into the 60s for the Liberals. Like, they're kind of like, oh man, do I really have? They're not proud of the campaign. So they needed to inject some life into the campaigners themselves to get on the phones and say, "Do you see how our guy did last night? Isn't it amazing? I know, Mrs. Jones, can I help you?" No, nothing. Forget the format. It didn't transpire. So again, I'll suggest this. I think there was a point in the campaign where the Liberals slid. Remember, we had that conversation about, Aaron O'Toole's not going forward; they're just sliding back. And we said at that time it's going to be really hard, if not impossible, for the Liberals to return. Well, it's true; they're not returning. They're where they are. I think they're going to end up probably out of minority position. The way I'd call it right now is a minority, at least for the Conservatives, maybe more. Let's see. In lower mainland of British Columbia, the Liberals are getting absolutely crushed. No one's talking about that. They're like 17% out there. But you know whose day it's over for? That's Justin Trudeau. He's either going to have to take a walk in the leaves or a walk in the snow, because last night was the nadir of his prime ministership. The only thing he got off was he sent a photograph to Leila Fernandez just before the show saying, "I'm watching, but I got to go do the debate." That's like him, don't let the door hit you too hard on the way out. And it's sad to see in some ways for Liberals, but my goodness, it's an unnecessary election who interrupted our television time to watch great sports, and I think that's the way a lot of people see it. Honestly.
Yeah, I'm disappointed I wasn't watching more of the tennis, Keith. So, and that's what it's kind of come down to. It speaks to, and without being glib or, really sarcastic, and I'm happy to be both most often, but to John's point, I think we're almost at a place where Canadians have just decided we need to hit the reset button, period. It's not about political strategy. It's not about political stripe or party. We've been through the pandemic over the last 2 years. We've had enough of the bullshit that's gone with all the lockdowns and all the restrictions around in our lives. At this point, we want some level of clarity and sanity. And I get the more and more impression around the political discussion away from pundits is that's what people are looking for. So to John's point, it's almost like we need to hit the reset button. So if that means a whole new raft of leaders, or we're going to have to reset the party or wherever it is. But let's face it, we'll be back at this in 2 years.
Well, I suspect we will, but I suspect what you've just spoken about is why we were seeing Mad Max polling at something like 10 or 11% in the latest poll. Starting out at what, 1% when this campaign started, or just before the campaign? That's stunning. The crowds he's drawing are quite frankly stunning. And who are they drawing from? Who is he drawing these crowds from? Is it from everybody? They seem to be all walks of life, but I don't know if they're all conservative supporters originally that are going farther right, or if he's drawing from all sorts. He's drawing families to these rallies. And I think it was a big mistake, actually. I think he should have been on the stage last night, perhaps rather than Mr. Blanchette or even Mrs. Paul. He should have been there. I mean, if he's pulling that high, shutting him out, but keeping him out of the debates only feeds into all those people who say he's being muzzled. He's willing to get arrested for our cause, for the freedoms, for the reset that we need, because our politicians are all the same. It's very interesting. I think back to the debate, though, what we're going to see is the clips played over and over from the debate. And while each has some strong ones, I thought the one that's going to haunt Mr. O'Toole is, "I am driving the bus." He actually repeated that when the question said, who's driving your bus? Is it you? Is it the Rifle Association? Is it the caucus? Is it the members? And he looked very vulnerable. That "I am driving the bus," if I was the Liberals, I'd be playing that one a heck of a lot in my ads. But the Liberals as well look just as weak and just as vulnerable on many points as well. Mr. Trudeau did not come across as a strong leader. Is it the worst night of his career? Perhaps, right? It's when the whole cult or personality of Mr. Trudeau leading the pack just is absolutely disintegrated, just is vaporized. It's not there. So now where's the policies? Why did you call this election? And it keeps coming back to that. Why'd you call the election in the pandemic, when there was unfinished work in Afghanistan, when the fires are, the forest fires, the wildfires are going crazy? All these things that no one was stopping your government from dealing with. So it all boils right back down to, why did you call the election? And I think not being able to give a solid answer for that is why he's slipping and O'Toole is rising. I don't think either one is offering anything particularly great for voters, but that's what's happening right now. And Mr. Singh is just, he hasn't increased his voter support. It doesn't appear. Everyone likes him, but he hasn't done much to increase what the NDP's turnout is likely to be.
Well, let me tell you a couple of things about some of the performers there. One who will be there next time and one who probably won't be. So you're absolutely right, Keith. And we can actually find the time when the PPC started to rise. So the PPC started to rise in the week following, in the week of August the 17th. So if you go back to July, flat as piss in a plate, like 1 or 2 points, all the way back to the last election. What happened in August the 10th was the Quebec premier indicated that a passport was coming out, and it was going to tie to it a whole series of conditions, and it was going to tell you got to go and get jabbed in the arm. And then Ontario started talking about it, British Columbia started talking about it. So we actually see in the actual numbers the momentum moving forward from that date forward. It escalates. So Frank Graves at Ecos has got them sitting at 9 or 10. You're absolutely right. If you take the average across the country, it's 5.4%. I've done polling since Tuesday with 1,500 sample. All right, so it gives me just a blink of an idea of who these people are, but they're right across the country. They're every walk of life. They're coming from every party, and they're being driven by this, these guys are a bunch of, the leaders of the governments are being tyrannical, and I'm going to fight back because it's my right not to get jabbed. It's all that's anti-government stuff. Those people were there last night because as you watch the candidates walk onto that entrance leading up to the facility, they had been pushed into the background, but they were all there. The PPC people were all there. There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. So let's look at the dynamic for next time. Anna May Paul, I've marveled at from day one, but I've always believed that she should be the deputy leader of the NDP. I mean, she's a little bit like, Bob Rae, who decided he'd take a shot and lead the Liberals. You know what, Anna May? Go to another party. Elizabeth May and her gang just want to talk about the environment, and every question last night would have been turned into, well, if you saw the burning fires in British Columbia, that's what it would have been turned into. She was able to articulate all kinds of topics, like foreign affairs and everything. She handled herself well. Get off the stage, go and join Jugmeat, do that stuff. But you're absolutely right, Keith. Guess who's showing up next time? Maxime Bernier. And it'll be a totally different, it'll be like something we've never seen before. And it's going to be a very, very hostile debate because it's going to be all about you are bad people, you are putting down the people, we're about democracy, and the other people are going to say, you're not doing what society wants, blah, blah, blah. They better have a proper format for that, I tell you, because it's going to be explosive when he's on the stage, especially with his people.
Well, I'll be curious to see how this sort of grinds through the general population over the next few days. So we'll count on you, John, to keep an ear and an eye on that. That'll do it for the Friday edition of The Writ Race. I'm Dave Trafford with John Wright and Keith Leslie. The Writ Race is an Eye Contact podcast.